The first sign something was off was not the meeting title. It was the time. 6:43 in the morning, not 6:30, not 7, 6:43. The kind of time someone chooses when they want to catch people half awake and slightly off balance. I was standing in my kitchen in Arlington, barefoot on the cool tile, waiting for the coffee to finish dripping when the calendar alert lit up my screen. Operational realignment, mandatory attendance. I remember the soft click of the coffee maker and the pale blue light coming through the window over the sink. My apartment was still quiet. I had not even dried my hair yet. I set my mug down, looked at the invite again, and accepted it. By 6:43, I was in conference room B with wet hair twisted back, a navy cardigan over an old concert t-shirt, and a legal pad tucked under my arm. 3 people were already there. Derek Shaw, our chief technology officer, sat at the end of the table with his hands folded like he was about to moderate a panel. Beside him were 2 HR women with identical neat folders and the careful faces people use when they want credit for being kind while doing something unkind. Derek gave me a small smile. "Maya," he said, "thanks for coming in early." I sat down and placed my coffee beside the pad. "Of course." There was a pause, not a natural one, the arranged kind. Then he said, "As the company moves into a more automated operating model, some roles are being phased out." One of the HR women looked down at her page before adding, "This is a position elimination, not a performance matter." I nodded once. Derek leaned back in his chair. "In simple terms, the new system can handle what your team used to do." He said it casually. That was the part I remember most. Not cruel exactly, just casual. As though he were pointing out that an old printer had finally been replaced. I did not argue. I did not ask them to repeat it. I looked at the packet they slid toward me, turned the first page, then the second, then the third. On the 4th page, I saw a date, 2 days before my renewal clause. I touched the corner of the paper with my thumb and said, "I see." The HR woman started explaining severance, continued benefits, return of equipment, transition cooperation. She kept her voice light and even. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear a copier running. Someone laughed near the break room. The building smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and burnt espresso. I remember thinking that ordinary sounds can make a strange moment feel even stranger. Derek kept talking. Something about efficiency, something about next steps. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. Who reviewed the platform agreement before scheduling this? He blinked. It was small, but I noticed it. The HR women exchanged a look that lasted less than a second. Derek smiled again, though not as easily this time. "Legal has everything in order," he said. I wrote the answer down on my pad as if I were taking notes in a routine meeting. Then I thanked them for letting me know. That seemed to confuse all 3 of them. The meeting ended with the usual gestures people make when they want the scene to stay tidy. A folder pushed across the table, a reminder about confidentiality, an offer to contact HR with further questions. I stood, gathered the packet, and left without rushing. Back at my desk, the office was just beginning to wake up. Overhead lights hummed softly. Someone in operations was unwrapping breakfast at the next row of desks. My monitor still showed the dashboard I had been reviewing the night before. For 10 years, I had built large parts of that system with my own hands. Not alone, of course. No one builds something that size alone. But I knew where the old workarounds lived. I knew which reports looked healthy when they were not. I knew which vendors still used outdated integrations nobody wanted to admit were still in place. I knew what happened at 2 a.m. when traffic spiked from the western depots and one aging relay started to hesitate. I knew the system the way some people know a house they have lived in for years, which floorboard shifts, which window sticks in winter, which light has to be tapped once before it holds. At 7:18, I opened a private note on my phone and entered 3 things. Meeting time, termination date, need contract copy from home file. Then I put the phone face down. No speech, no scene, just a list. Around 8:30, Derek stopped by my desk with a visitor badge clipped to one finger. "We'll have the transition team in next week," he said. "A short handoff should be enough." I looked up at him. "I'm sure they'll have questions." He smiled as though that settled it. Then he walked away. I watched him cross the floor, disappear into the glass hallway, and I had the quiet, familiar feeling I get when a number in a report looks fine at first glance and wrong at second. That evening after I got home, I set the folder on my kitchen table, changed into sweatpants, and pulled a gray storage box from the hall closet. Inside were tax files, old lease papers, 2 passports I no longer used, and a signed agreement I had not looked at in years. I placed it on the table beside the severance packet and turned on the lamp. Then I waited. The lamp on my kitchen table cast a small yellow circle over the papers. Everything else in the apartment was dim. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Somewhere upstairs, a cabinet door closed. I remember those sounds because they made the room feel steady, and I needed steady. I opened the older agreement first. It was the original platform licensing file from when the company had restructured our internal logistics software into a separate operating framework. At the time, the executives had wanted something polished enough to pitch to partners and vague enough to describe as proprietary innovation. What they actually had was a patchwork system that had grown over years of late nights, outage fixes, vendor accommodations, and emergency rebuilds. I had named the framework Northline, not in a sentimental way, just because every system needs a name, and that one had stayed. I sat down with a pen and a stack of tabs and began reading from the beginning, slowly. Definitions, ownership language, deployment terms, maintenance obligations, renewal language, separation provisions, amendment references. The wording was dry, the kind that makes most people skim by the second page. I did not skim. By 9:10, I had marked 4 sections. By 9:22, I had found the one I was looking for, not hidden, not dramatic. Just written in the same clean font as everything else, under a subsection most people would never read carefully unless something had already gone wrong. I placed one finger on the paragraph and read it a second time, then a third. The company had broad operational use rights. That part was true. But the license itself was tied to active maintenance authority under original architecture control. If employment ended without cause before the renewal conversion, continued deployment required a separate reaffirmation event. That reaffirmation had never happened. For 6 years, no one had raised the question. Legal had approved the framework. Finance had processed the renewals. Leadership had changed titles, org charts, and reporting lines. But nobody had gone back through the source terms with the kind of care they would have used if they actually understood what the system was holding together. I turned to the severance packet and found the termination date again. 2 days early, not accidental in my opinion. Careful, calculated, probably designed to avoid the next contract cycle and whatever attached to it. They had treated it like timing, a neat little savings decision. I wrote 3 lines on my legal pad. 1. Confirm dates. 2. Confirm source headers and registry status. 3. Do not sign anything. That was the moment something shifted for me, not emotionally, logically. All day they had behaved as though I should absorb the decision and react to it. Be hurt. Be grateful. Be embarrassed. Defend myself. Accept their explanation. But once the papers were in front of me, the problem changed shape. It was no longer about how I felt about being dismissed. It was about what was true. I got up, rinsed my coffee mug, and came back with a glass of water. Then I opened my personal laptop. There were parts of my work life I kept in company systems, of course. But over the years, I had also kept careful personal records, always within the rules, always focused on authorship, licensing, and architecture submissions, version histories, filing receipts, dated drafts, cross-reference notes from system migrations and legal review cycles. Not because I expected a fight one day, more because I had spent too many years being the person everyone called after things broke. I learned early that memory helps, but documentation lasts longer. At 10:03, I logged into my records archive and pulled the old submission folder. There it was, the original framework registration under my development entity, filed before the company expanded the deployment environment. Supplemental notes, amendment acknowledgments, header language from a later release branch, email confirmation from in-house counsel. No ambiguity, no mystery. Just paper, timestamps, and signatures. I did not feel triumphant. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired in that particular way that comes when you realize people were comfortable dismissing you because they had never bothered to understand the structure they depended on. They knew my title, they knew my salary, they knew I fixed problems, but they had not respected the actual shape of the work. A little after 10:30, my phone lit up with a message from a colleague in operations. Heard about this morning. I'm sorry. Are you okay? I looked at it for a long time before answering. I'm fine. Just organizing my records tonight. That was true. I set the phone down and returned to the files. I printed 2 documents on my home printer and placed them side by side on the table. Then I highlighted the dates that mattered: contract renewal date, termination date, original licensing language, architecture control clause. Step by step, the mess became smaller. By midnight, I had built a clean folder. Not everything, just what mattered. A timeline, a copy of the agreement, registry proof, source header references, notes on the renewal sequence. I clipped the papers together and wrote 1 line across the top page: review before exit processing. Then I turned off the lamp, carried the folder to the counter, and stood for a moment in the dark kitchen. The city outside had gone quiet. The window above the sink reflected the room back at me, my own face, the papers. The chair pulled slightly away from the table. In the morning, I had walked into a meeting thinking I was being removed from a system. By midnight, I knew something else. They had removed the wrong person without checking what exactly they were standing on. Then I waited. The next morning, I got to the office a little before 8. The lobby smelled like lemon cleaner and fresh coffee. Someone had changed the arrangement at the front desk. White flowers instead of the usual green stems. Small things always stood out to me on days when larger things were moving underneath. I still had access to the building. No one had thought to cut that off early. At my desk, I set down my bag, powered on my machine, and opened the documents I had reviewed the night before. I did not rush. I answered 2 routine messages, cleared 1 ticket that had been assigned before the meeting, forwarded a vendor note to the person who would need it next week. From the outside, I imagine I looked calm because I was calm, not happy, not resigned, just clear. At 8:37, Derek sent a message asking whether I could join the transition session at 10 with the incoming architecture team. I replied, yes, I'll be there. Then I opened the internal repository and started checking details. Source headers first, then release ownership notes, then the deployment registry. The company had forked pieces of the operational stack over the years, but not as thoroughly as leadership liked to pretend in board meetings. Some services had been rebuilt. Some had been wrapped in cleaner language. Some had simply been renamed and moved, but the core framework still carried the original structure, including the licensing references nobody seemed to have revisited. I documented everything carefully: repository branch history, header continuity, verification interval, renewal behavior, administrative authority path, no commentary, just facts. At 9:12, I printed another short packet and added it to the folder in my bag. Then I made a second list on my legal pad. Step 1, attend handoff. Step 2, say only what is necessary. Step 3, do not rescue people from decisions they chose knowingly. That list mattered, not because I intended to do anything dramatic, but because I knew my old habit. I solve problems. I fill gaps. I explain things before other people even realize they are confused. I had done it for 10 years. It had made me useful, and in some ways it had also made me convenient. That morning, I decided silence would have rules. At 10, I walked into the conference room with my notebook and a printed system map. 5 people from the outside team were already there. 4 younger men and 1 woman, all in company-branded quarter zips, laptops open, energy slightly too bright for the hour. The projector hummed. Someone had ordered pastries. Derek stood near the screen with the relaxed confidence people get when they believe a difficult transition is already behind them. He introduced everyone quickly. The new lead, Evan, gave me a polite smile and said, "We've heard a lot about the legacy environment." Legacy. That word again. I sat down and said, "I'm sure you have." For the next hour, I walked them through the operational layout: traffic arbitration, warehouse sync behavior, vendor relay handling, reporting dependencies, the older integrations that still mattered even though no one liked admitting they were old. I explained where documentation was complete and where it was thin. I noted which systems looked independent but were not. I told them which nightly checks were safe to ignore once and which ones were not safe to ignore even once. They nodded, typed, asked a few surface questions. Then Evan said, "Our plan is to containerize most of this and shift control into a cleaner cloud orchestration layer. Once that's done, I think a lot of these legacy constraints disappear." I looked at him for a moment. There are moments when a room tells you everything you need to know. The soft tapping of keys. Derek leaning back, pleased. One of the engineers already half reading something else on his screen. A plate with untouched pastries going slightly stale under the conference room lights. I said, "Some constraints are technical, some are contractual. I would suggest reviewing both before changing the verification path." Derek gave a small laugh. "Legal has all of that covered." I turned 1 page in my notebook. "Good," I said. That was all. The session continued. I answered what I chose to answer. I showed them the visible parts of the framework and named the sections that required careful review. I did not speculate. I did not argue. I did not try to impress anyone. By the end, I could tell they thought I was being formal, maybe even distant. In truth, I was being exact. Around noon, I returned to my desk and found an email from HR reminding me about my exit processing slot at 2:15. I read it once, archived it, and opened a secure folder on my local drive. Into it, I saved clean copies of the documents I was entitled to keep: my authored materials, my licensing records, my registration confirmations, my contract history, and my dated notes. No company client data, no credentials, no confidential exports outside my rights. I was careful about that. Careful matters. At 1:40, Derek stopped by again. "We appreciate your professionalism," he said. I looked up from my screen. "I'm glad to hear that." He hesitated, as if expecting more. When none came, he added, "I know this isn't ideal." "No," I said, "it isn't." He gave me the thin nod of a man who wanted agreement more than conversation, then moved on. A few minutes later, I logged one final administrative note in my personal records. Transition team informed to review verification path. No substantive follow-up questions asked. Then I closed the file. At 2:11, I took my folder, my badge, and the printed copy of the original agreement and walked down the hall toward HR. The carpet muted my steps. Someone in sales was laughing too loudly in a nearby office. The copier was running again. Ordinary office sounds. Ordinary light. Ordinary people moving through an afternoon they assumed would stay ordinary. The folder in my hand was not heavy, but it was enough. Then I waited. The HR office was always colder than the rest of the floor. Not dramatically cold. Just enough to make the room feel formal and faintly unwelcoming. There was a diffuser on the credenza pushing out something mint-like, and a glass bowl of wrapped candies no one ever touched. I sat across from a compliance manager named Allison, with another HR representative beside her, and set my folder on the table before either of them began. Allison gave me the practiced smile people use when they want the process to move more smoothly than the truth. "We'll go through the separation packet, final acknowledgments, and property return," she said. I nodded. "All right." She started with the checklist: laptop return, badge surrender, benefits notice, confidentiality reminder. Then she slid the severance agreement toward me and tapped the signature tab at the bottom. "I know you've had some time to review," she said. "If everything looks good, we can finalize today." I opened the document again, even though I already knew what it said. The amended language was still there, buried in the middle of the packet under the usual compensation and release sections: expanded assignment rights, broader derivative claims, post-employment architecture language that went further than the original contract. Too far. I looked up. "I won't be signing this version." The second HR representative blinked first. Allison kept her expression in place, but I could see the slight pause at the edge of it. "Is there a specific concern?" she asked. "Yes." I turned the packet around, pointed to the clause, and then pulled the older agreement from my folder. I placed both documents side by side on the table. "This language exceeds the original rights framework," I said. "It also attempts to absorb post-separation architecture interests that were not assigned in the underlying agreement." Allison glanced down, then over to the other representative, then back to me. "Our legal team prepared the document," she said carefully. "I'm sure they did." That answer sat there for a moment. I kept my voice even. "I'm declining severance under these terms. I'll return company property as required, but I won't sign an expansion of rights that wasn't part of my employment agreement." The other representative finally spoke. "You understand? That means giving up the payout." "I do." There was no speech after that. No warning from me. No dramatic line. Just the sound of pages being lifted and set back down, and the faint rattle of the air vent above us. Allison tried once more. "If this is about timing, I'm sure legal can explain the intent." "This isn't about intent," I said. "It's about text." That ended that part of the conversation. She moved on to the inventory section. I handed over my badge, confirmed my device return for later that afternoon, initialed the checklist where required. The whole thing became smaller once I stopped letting it be emotional. A process can only do so much if you insist on reading every line. When we finished, Allison asked, "Do you have any final questions?" I rested one hand on the folder. "Yes. I'd like written confirmation of my termination date and status classification exactly as entered into the system." That drew another pause. "Of course," she said, "and I'd like a copy sent today." "We can arrange that." I thanked her, gathered my papers, and stood. As I reached the door, Allison said, "Maya, for what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened." I turned back just enough to answer her honestly. "I believe you are. That doesn't change the paperwork." Then I left. Back at my desk, I packed the last of my things into 2 boxes: a framed photo of my sister and her kids at a lakeside picnic, a ceramic mug with a chipped handle, a notebook full of outage sketches and deployment diagrams written across too many late nights, a small desk lamp I had bought myself because the overhead lights always gave me a headache after 6. Around me, the office carried on. Keyboards clicked, someone reheated soup. A meeting room door opened and closed. It struck me that most institutional harm happens in places that still smell like burnt coffee and copier toner. Nothing about the setting announces what it is. At 3:06, I received the written HR confirmation by email. Termination classification. Involuntary, non-performance, effective that day at 2:15 p.m. I saved a copy to my personal records folder and printed one page. That was step 1. Step 2 was verification. There were still a few administrative systems I could lawfully access until IT completed deactivation. I used that window carefully. I opened the internal registry console, reviewed the active licensing status, and confirmed what I already suspected. The deployment environment was still tied to the original framework authority chain. No substitute reaffirmation, no revised sign-off, no executed transfer, just assumptions layered on top of old structure. I documented timestamps only. Nothing altered, nothing removed, just observed and recorded. Step 3 was restraint. That may sound passive, but it was not. Restraint is active when you know more than the people around you and choose not to spend your last hour protecting them from their own negligence. At 4:10, the outside team lead stopped by my desk with a paper plate in his hand and asked, almost casually, "Any weird gotchas we should know before next week?" I closed the notebook I had been packing. "Yes," I said. "Read the old agreements before you touch verification." He smiled like I was half joking. "Good to know." I held his gaze for a second, long enough to make it clear I was not joking at all. Then I said, "It is." He nodded once and moved on. At 4:42, I'd finally revoked my network credentials. My screen refreshed, and the session ended. Just like that. I shut down the machine, placed the laptop in the return sleeve, lifted my boxes, and stood there for a moment beside the desk I had occupied for nearly a decade. The chair was pushed in, the monitor black, the surface clean except for a faint square of dust where the lamp had been. I put the phone face down in my coat pocket. Then I walked out through the lobby carrying my boxes into the soft gray light of early evening. At home, I set everything on the dining table, changed clothes, washed my hands, and made tea. While the kettle heated, I opened my folder once more and laid out the 4 documents that now mattered more than anything anyone had said to me that morning. The original agreement, the amended severance, the HR status confirmation, the registry notes. I read them in that order. When I finished, I reached for my pen and wrote one final line beneath the 3 earlier steps. Step 4. Let the record speak first. Then I heard my phone buzz across the counter. The message was from Derek. "Need to speak with you first thing tomorrow. Call me when you can." I read it once, set the phone down, and finished making tea. That may sound cold, but it was not. I had spent enough years in corporate rooms to know the difference between urgency and delayed recognition. If they had wanted to understand the structure before acting, they had a long time to do it. A message at the end of the day did not suddenly create an emergency on my side. I carried the mug to the table, sat down, and waited 10 full minutes before answering. "Please send any questions in writing." He called anyway. I watched the screen light up, then go dark, then light again. After the 3rd attempt, I let it ring once more and then sent the same reply. "In writing, please." A minute later, the email arrived. It was short. Too short. He said the transition team had identified possible ambiguity in the licensing framework and wanted clarification regarding renewal control, verification authority, and the continued deployment status of the platform after my separation. The tone was careful, not apologetic, not yet, just cautious. I read it slowly, then opened a blank document and drafted my answer. I kept it narrow. I confirmed receipt. I stated that the governing terms were already contained in the original framework agreement and related records. I noted that I had declined to sign any amended severance language that attempted to expand those rights. I also stated that any further discussion should include counsel and complete document review. Then I sent it. No emotion, no theater, just sequence. The next morning at 8:12, I received a calendar invite for a video call at 9 with Derek, someone from legal, and the chief operating officer. The title read, Contract Clarification Discussion. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because large institutions become very polite when they realize the paperwork may not favor them. At 8:55, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, my notes, and the same yellow folder. Morning light came through the window over the sink. A truck backed up somewhere outside with that slow beeping sound you hear in apartment lots. I had washed my mug, wiped the counter, and tied my hair back before opening the meeting link. Routine first. Always. 3 faces appeared. Derek looked tired. The lawyer, a woman named Denise Hall, had a printed set of documents in front of her and the expression of someone trying to remain composed while mentally reworking a timeline. The COO, Martin Vale, came on last. Crisp shirt, direct gaze, no small talk. "Maya," he said, "thank you for joining on short notice." "Good morning," Denise began. "We're reviewing the operational licensing structure tied to the Northline framework. There appear to be provisions that may affect continuity, and we wanted to discuss interpretation." I folded my hands on the table. "There is no interpretation issue on my side," I said. "There is a document issue on yours." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Derek said, "We were under the impression the company held full continuing rights." "You hold the rights you contracted for?" I said. "Not the ones added later in severance language, and not the ones assumed without reaffirmation." Denise glanced down at her papers. "Our review shows the deployment environment continued under internal renewal processing for several years." "Yes," Martin leaned forward. "Then why would continuity now be in question?" Because this was the first moment that mattered, I answered very carefully. Because internal processing is not the same as legal conversion. The system can continue under habit for a long time. That does not change the underlying terms. Derek shifted in his chair. "If there was a risk here, why wasn't this raised sooner?" I looked at him. "It was written into the framework. That is how it was raised." That landed, not dramatically, quietly, which is usually more effective. Denise cleared her throat. "To be precise, are you stating that your separation triggered a change in deployment authority?" "I'm stating that my separation ended the active condition that supported the existing renewal chain. You have the contract, you have the dates, you have the registry. Those three things should be read together." Martin asked, "Is the platform in immediate jeopardy?" I let the question sit for one breath before answering. "You should assume nothing is stable until your review is complete." That was the most direct thing I said in the meeting. Derek rubbed a hand over his mouth. For the first time since I had known him, he looked less polished than uncertain. Denise said, "What would you need in order to discuss a path forward?" There it was, clean and simple at last. I opened the folder, though I already knew the order of my points. "First," I said, "all discussion goes through council from this point on." She nodded and wrote that down. "Second, any path forward starts with acknowledgement of the original framework terms and the failed attempt to expand them through severance." Another note. "Third, no one touches verification or deployment controls until a proper review is done." Martin's expression changed at that. Not anger, concern with edges. "That could delay operations," he said. "Yes," I said. "It could." He looked at Denise, then back at me. I did not fill the silence for them. That was the whole point. For years, I had been the person who bridged every uncomfortable pause with explanation, context, reassurance, options. This time I let the facts remain where they were. Eventually Martin said, "We'll have legal follow-up today." "All right." Derek started to say something, then stopped. The lawyer closed her folder. The COO ended with a brief, formal thanks, the kind used when people are trying to keep control of a room that has already shifted away from them. When the call ended, I closed the laptop, carried my mug to the sink, and rinsed it out. Then I waited. Legal followed up at 11:17, not with a debate, not with a threat, just a formal email requesting documentation exchange and proposing a call with outside counsel that afternoon. That told me everything I needed to know. Internally, they had already reached the stage where confidence gives way to verification. I forwarded the message to my attorney, a quiet contracts lawyer named Susan, who had helped me years earlier when I structured my development entity and cleaned up some old licensing language. She was not dramatic. I like that in professionals. She read quickly, spoke carefully, and never confused volume with leverage. At 2R, the four of us joined the call. Susan and I were on one side. Denise Hall and outside counsel were on the other. No Derek, no COO. That also told me something. Once the room narrows to lawyers, the performance usually ends. The discussion was plain. Dates were reviewed first, my termination date, the renewal conversion date, the original execution timeline for the framework. Then they moved to authorship records, architecture control, and the scope of the company's operating rights versus ownership claims. Susan walked through it methodically, page by page, like someone laying silverware in a straight line. There was no argument worth repeating, mostly because there was not much to argue with. The records were clear. The company had extensive use rights under the original agreement, yes, but the continuing authority they had assumed after my separation was not supported the way they believed it was. Their severance language had tried to solve that after the fact by broadening the assignment terms. I had declined it. That mattered. The dates mattered. The written terms mattered. At one point, their outside counsel asked whether I was open to discussing a transitional license solution while preserving my rights. Susan looked at me. I said, yes, if the structure reflects the actual record. That was the first real movement. By early evening, a draft proposal arrived. It was better than I expected and not as good as it needed to be. A short-term consulting arrangement, limited acknowledgement language, temporary continuity terms. They were trying to stabilize operations without fully admitting how badly they had misread the ground under them. I marked up the draft with a pen at my dining table while rain tapped lightly against the window. The room smelled faintly of ginger from the tea I had made an hour earlier. My apartment was quiet except for the low hiss of tires outside on wet pavement. I made my own list. Recognition of original framework terms, separate paid license agreement, consulting scope defined in writing. No retroactive claim over unassigned rights. Public correction limited to facts. No informal contact outside counsel channel. Then I sent it back. The next morning, they accepted most of it. By noon, after one more pass between lawyers, the final structure was in place. The company would enter a paid license and advisory agreement through my entity. My authorship and control rights would remain intact as originally documented. Any future modifications to the framework would require formal review. They would also issue a written internal correction, clarifying that the platform's architecture and licensing position had been misstated during transition planning. Not a dramatic apology, not a confession. Just a correction anchored in documents, dates, and authority, which, in my opinion, is usually the more durable form of truth. A revised agreement was sent for signature at 3:40. I read every page. Susan read every page. Then I signed. After that, the operational handoff moved into a very different shape. Not because anyone had become kinder, because the rules were clear now, and clear rules change tone faster than emotion ever does. Questions that had once come to me as assumptions started arriving as requests. Schedules became more careful, language became more precise. The same people who had treated my role like something easily replaced were suddenly interested in exact wording, dependencies, and review order. That is often how it goes. People do not always respect labor while it is quietly holding things together. They start respecting structure when they realize it has terms. 3 days later, I received the internal correction memo through counsel. It was brief, professional, dated. It acknowledged that my separation had occurred before a required contractual conversion point, and that subsequent continuity assumptions had been made without full document reconciliation. It also confirmed that the company and my entity had entered a new agreement governing ongoing platform use and advisory access. I printed it and placed it in the folder with the others: original agreement, termination notice, registry records, final signed resolution, correction memo, 5 pieces of paper. That was all it took in the end. Not an outburst, not a campaign, not a dramatic reveal in a boardroom, just records that held. That evening, Susan called to say, "You handled this well." I thanked her. Then I put the phone face down on the table and stood there for a moment in the quiet. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, everything was finally still. A week later, the quiet felt different. Not empty. Organized. I woke up without an alarm for the first time in years. The apartment was still dim, the sky just starting to brighten behind the buildings across the street. I padded into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and listened to that soft rising hum while the water heated. For a long time, my mornings had begun with alerts, server pings, overnight errors, Slack messages from different time zones, a constant low buzz of responsibility before the day had even properly started. That morning there was none of that, just the kettle clicking off. I poured hot water over tea leaves and carried the mug to the small balcony outside my living room. The air smelled faintly like wet pavement from the night before. Someone down the block was walking a dog that kept stopping to inspect every tree. Ordinary things. I sat there for a while and let my mind settle. The agreement with the company had been finalized 2 days earlier. My advisory hours were defined, my rights were preserved, and the platform now operated under the new license structure exactly as written. I would still answer questions when they came. I would still review architectural changes. But the balance had shifted. Not dramatically, just correctly. Inside, my dining table was still covered with folders from the past week. I had been organizing them into long-term storage. Not because I expected to revisit the situation, but because I have always believed that records deserve proper homes once they have served their purpose. I stacked the papers neatly. The original framework agreement, the termination notice, the registry verification, the final contract, the correction memo. I slid them into a single archive folder, labeled it with the year, and placed it in the storage cabinet beside my desk. Then I wiped the table clean. That small action felt important. Not symbolic, just practical. Problems should not live on the table longer than necessary once they are resolved. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message from an old colleague who had heard a version of the story through industry channels. Is it true what happened? I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back a simple answer. The documents spoke for themselves. A minute later, she replied with a laughing emoji and one more line. I might need advice someday. I smiled at that, because that, more than anything else, is the part people rarely talk about. Situations like this are never as unique as they feel when they happen. Every company has someone quietly holding together a system no one else fully understands. Every workplace has someone whose patience and knowledge are mistaken for replaceability. Sometimes those people call later. Sometimes they just need someone who has been through it once. I finished my tea, rinsed the mug, and opened the window to let in a little more air. The afternoon light had shifted across the living room floor. The city sounded calm, cars passing, someone laughing 2 floors down, a delivery truck door closing, life moving forward the way it always does. Before I stepped away from the desk, I checked one last thing, the platform dashboard. Everything was green, traffic steady, system stable, exactly as it should be. I closed the laptop and left it there on the table while I went to start dinner. And if you've listened this far, I'm glad you stayed with me through the story. If you enjoyed it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might think. And I'm always curious where people are listening from, so leave a comment telling me your city and what time it is where you are right now. 2 other stories like this one will be appearing on your screen next. You might find them interesting. For now, though, that's where this one ends.